Right, that's a bit calmer than when I was last here. Our final session before, well, hopefully some lunch, focuses on the thorny issue of supply. As we've been discussing throughout the day, the government is promising to deliver 300,000 new homes a year by the middle of the next decade. The National Housing Federation has done sums to suggest that the figure actually should be 340,000 every year, starting right now. So they don't think the government's ambition is ambitious enough. And, says the NHF, more than 40% of those homes should be genuinely affordable, with 90,000 a year for social rent, a complete step change in from where we have been up to now. If we're going to get close to those kind of numbers on a consistent basis, and if those homes are going to be of the right kind, in the right places, at the right price, then we cannot just carry on doing the same things that we've always done. This is clearly a time for great ideas, for big thinking. And as luck would have it, we have two heavyweight thinkers on housing to consider this challenge this afternoon. Lord Heseltine has been at the heart of politics for more than half a century as MP, Cabinet Minister and Deputy Prime Minister. More recently, he's worked as an advisor to what is now the Ministry of Housing, chairing the Thames Estuary Growth Commission and offering advice on estate regeneration. And Mark Farmer has almost 30 years' experience in the construction and real estate sectors, at the forefront of emerging UK residential markets, including, as we've been discussing, build-to-rent, off-site construction and later living. He's advised government on the building labour market and off-site. He's regularly reviewing things for ministers and has recently founded a new real estate and construction consultancy called CAST. Welcome to two extraordinary figures in this sector. Each is going to address you, and then we will have time, hopefully, for some questions and indeed some answers. But first of all, if you could please welcome Lord Michael Heseltine.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to have a chance to participate in this interesting conference. And the time limits mean that one has got to skate extremely fast over the subjects, really talking headline terms. My first point is that I think that Whitehall is not organized effectively to deliver the housing needs of this country. And basically, it is because there are various people, various groups, various quangos in charge, and there is nobody in charge of them with the ability to coordinate, drive, and give the momentum that the present problems require. Self-evidently, we have Homes England, which has got a great deal of money and is a vital ingredient in the process, but it is an independent quango. Planning regimes are spread in central government, local government, and many quangos have a large input into that. The need to deliver brownfield existing land all over Whitehall. Each Whitehall department fights its battle to keep its land, inventing ever more curious future opportunities that sound attractive, but have the main purpose of actually making sure the land remains in the department where it actually is. And for me, the object of the exercise is not to build just more houses. It is important to build more houses. But what we should be doing is building communities of which people are proud and where they want to live. And they will be mixed tenure housing, freeholds and social housing and housing to rent. But they will be housing within communities, as I say, that have the sense of purpose and sense of pride, which build communities. And talking about just housing misses a very important point. And if I could do one thing to give a dynamic to this, I would build on the precedent of the Minister of Supply, Lord Beaverbrook, in the Second World War, who was in charge of the overall procurement programs necessary to conduct that war. I think that this is the first step that needs to take place, is that all of the ingredients that I've listed, and many that I haven't listed, should come under one executive supremo based in the DCLG department. It was my privilege to work there for many years, and I'm fully aware of the little compartmentalized budgets. When I was Secretary of State many years ago, once you'd agreed your departmental budget with the Treasury, you could flex from one compartment to another as the needs struck you. But now, I think over many years, the Treasury have got further and further, deeper and deeper into hypothecating money to specific programs. So the ability to move from one to the other is much more limited than it was in my time. That should all change. It should be within the gift of the Secretary of State, through the Supremo, who would be answerable to him or her, to use the money within different programs, coordinating programs, sharing programs, whatever it may be, as the community requirements to build housing and communities developed. If I move on to my second example of what I think the dynamic requires, and that is the use of development corporations. Today, we know where the stations of HS2 are going to be. They are going to be huge communities. And it is necessary, in my view, to get access to the enhanced land value. We shouldn't just leave it to people field by field to get planning permission, see enormous increases in the value of land. There should be development corporations associated with the HS2 stations, and they should be run as self-developing activities, merging the public and private sector interests in that purpose. And of course, it would have a very significant effect of removing the expenditure presently counted in public expenditure. It would be very largely capable of being financed in the private sector. The Oxford-Cambridge corridor obviously is going to be a major generator of new communities. That requires development corporations to make it effective and to get on with it. The Thames crossing, the lower Thames crossings, there should be new communities on either side of the Thames, and again, they should be associated with development corporations. I came across, I haven't caught up with it recently, that Stevenage, the centre of Stevenage is a car park, or it was a car park. And that is a classic example of how we have brownfield sites which could be used for very substantial and very exciting development opportunities. So capturing the land values, development corporations to actually achieve the dynamics and the scale of thinking, the community vision as opposed to just housing field by field, very important. And without doubt, the newly created mayoral bodies should have a bigger role in the decision-making as to how housing is dealt with as they develop their conurbations. But housing is not just about the private sector and building new homes to buy. There is a very big opportunity in the way we manage our council estates. I was responsible until recently for David Cameron's initiative to challenge the 100 worst estates. I've never understood why the program of City Challenge in the 1990s was allowed to die. It was the most dynamic, transformational process of regenerating council estates we ever tried. And looking back on where it was given the chance, the most conspicuous, probably the Hume estate in Manchester, it shows what can be done if the determination is there to bring, first of all, the tenants into a dialogue about what they want to see. Secondly, to bring the private sector and other forms of finance into the rehabilitation of those council estates. And that, in my view, is an initiative that should be resurrected with speed. It is actually interesting. I did look at some figures on this. There are yes, there are now 200 tenant-led management arrangements, but there are 5,000 to 6,000 council estates. And one of the things that nobody does is to look at these estates in the round. They are expensive to manage for quite obvious reasons, but there isn't a budget that says, this is the total expenditure. Is there a better way of spending the money? Do we actually need to have an arrangement which literally depends upon different public bodies having their own particular responsibilities? There's someone, self-evidently, there's the educational department, there will be the police, there will be the social workers, there will be people dealing with all sorts of very uncomfortable social issues such as drugs and crime and all of that, and there will be the employment agencies. All of these are separate bodies that do not look or meet collectively to look at the problem of the estate themselves. And there are thousands of these estates. And I was dealing with 100 of the worst. And what came out of it, self-evidently, is that there was no coordination, and the tenants were not involved. If you're going to try and transform these estates, and many of them have got great areas of land that could be built into new housing opportunities, you have got to take the tenants with you. And so that is another important initiative which at the moment seems to be in disarray. My last point, in a very quick summary, it's necessary to reorganize the local authority pension schemes. There are too many of them, they're too small, there are huge sums of money involved, and their excuse is that because they're so small, they can't work out the risks. So what do? They go to America where someone is there to provide larger scale surveillance of the process, and they can invest their money there. There is an urgent need for the rationalization of the local authority pension schemes so that they can provide cash within the communities from which the money is drawn. Not reckless money to be wasted or risked in any sense, but it is an opportunity for the Treasury, who are fully aware of the need for this reform, to actually devise public-private sector schemes which enable the private sector to share in the social provision that is a very important part of what is needed. And of course, I will always regret that the deal that I did in 1979 over the sale of council houses to provide 75% of the proceeds for new social housing was abandoned very rapidly after I left the Department of the Environment and became Defense Secretary. If that had not happened, there wouldn't be today a shortage of social housing on the scale that it is and where we need it. So a new approach, one person in charge of the housing needs of our time. And there is an urgency, and I do not at the moment see that this is being addressed with the determination that I think appropriate. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Lord Heseltine. Our second speaker is Mark Farmer. Mark.
Thank you, Mark, and good afternoon, everyone. So the title of this session is Breaking Barriers to Building More. And my viewpoint on that challenge is quite simplistic. Some may say oversimplistic, but it has one central premise. And that is that we can use policy tools, and we've heard a lot already today about policy and emerging policy. We can use those tools to release more land. We can use it to liberalize and free up and make more effective the planning system. And indeed, we can put more funding into key areas of the housing sector, and that's relevant in the context of this morning's announcements as well. But what policy can't do, certainly not on a short or medium-term basis, is deal with the very real issues we now have in terms of resourcing and skills in this industry. And what we have is a problem which I think is unprecedented, and it's getting worse, in terms of the industry's physical production capacity, which is starting to weigh heavily on the ability of our industry to deliver the housing that we need. And human capital development, by its very nature, is a long-term play. To actually bring people into the industry, to train them in the right skills, to have them in the right places is not a quick fix. And policy that initiates that implicitly has a long-term impact and will require patience to deliver. And certainly if we're going to deliver anywhere near 300,000 homes a year or 340,000 homes a year, as NatFed is suggesting, we need to look at this skills and resourcing issue much more closely. So why do I believe that particular issue is such a barrier? Well, we're experiencing some structural changes in the construction industry we have not seen before, and that, I think, is going to change our ability to deliver in a way that is unprecedented. All sounds a bit melodramatic, and the review I wrote for the government nearly 2 years ago now set out the challenge in a fairly dramatic way in terms of the title being Modernise or Die. I have no reason to believe, nearly 2 years on, that the situation is any less serious. If anything, I think it's actually worse than I predicted. So we have to get busy in addressing this issue. We have one of the most labour-intensive industrial sectors across industry. We have very poor levels of productivity. We're facing the prospect of a declining workforce, and that's really where this is coming to in terms of driving a productivity imperative that we have not seen before. As an industry, we've morphed ourselves into a highly flexible, resilient, but fragmented structure. Not accidentally, but born out of the nature of the industry that we work in, the demand profile being very cyclical, certainly in private housing, and that has led to the industry subcontracting more and more. It's led to short-termism in terms of investment in skills and training, innovation, R&D, all the things that are now critically important. And the ability for us to, in the future, grow our production capacity and platform with periodic expansions of labour and labour force with the appropriate skills base embedded in it, I think, is over. I don't think we're going to have the ability to flex our labour force, certainly on an upward cycle, in the way that we've seen before. And there's 3 drivers for why I say that. One has already been touched on in the preceding session, which is demographics. We have an ageing workforce. If you look at the mode age group grouping in the construction industry, it's between 40 and 49 years old. We have a workforce, secondly, that is also highly migrant dependent, particularly here in London, but actually in other regional cities as well. And that's at a time when the wider geopolitical context and societal change is appearing to be questioning open border policies. And it's very clear that in a labour-intensive construction sector, that has big impacts on the way we deliver. And you only have to look at the Migration Advisory Commission report that was published yesterday to see what that might mean for our industry in terms of reliance on unskilled and low-skilled labour from the EU, which is at the moment a big structural flaw in our model. And lastly, we have an image issue, and again it was picked up in the preceding session. We're not seen as attractive as an industry to the young generation. There's a societal change taking place that means hard, physical, manual-based labour, analogue careers aren't attractive anymore. A recognition or lack of recognition of the worth of craft and trade skills, and that's gradually washing over our industry. And there's perceptions that persist, sometimes quite rightly, about poor working conditions, employment security, etc., etc. We're also fishing in a very limited pond. Only 11 to 12% of our industry is female. Only 1% of the construction workforce is female. So we're naturally limiting our ability to bring talent into our industry at a time when we need talent. It's not just headcount, we need talented people, motivated and engaged to address our issues. And construction offers a great opportunity to drive social mobility and you see lots of initiatives that look to address that challenge. My feeling is that many of them don't really have the impact they should. Lack of joined-up thinking, sometimes commercial imperatives stand in the way of really driving social mobility and social outcomes, and using the construction industry as the platform for that. So all of that sets a really challenging environment, and it's one that I believe the housing association sector is uniquely placed to address, not only in terms of a delivery challenge, but a social value challenge as well. And whilst the construction industry historically has always shown itself to be fairly reticent to change, that's always, in my view, been associated with one thing, that historically there's always been a choice to do something different, to either innovate or to continue doing what we're doing. My view is that that choice no longer exists, and that gradually industry is waking up, private and public sector, to the fact we have to change how we deliver. If we're going to address the productivity imperative, if we're going to address this declining workforce risk, that is starting to show itself in many different ways, whether it be financial risk, and we all know about what's happened with Carillion at the beginning of this year and showing the fragility of the construction market, whether it's consumers starting to fight back and not accepting poor quality construction because of the issues we've had in terms of not having sufficiently trained and skilled workers on projects, whether it's architects, engineers, bricklayers, it's across the piece. The political importance of all of this, I think, has been picked up on. We've had the Housing White Paper in early 2017, probably unprecedented as a policy document in the housing market in terms of its focus on skills, on innovation, diversification of the market. It wasn't just about land, planning, tenure, it was about the construction industry. That has been followed by the Industrial Strategy White Paper, and in turn, very importantly for our industry, the Construction Sector Deal, which is looking to inject money into our sector. The Social Housing Green Paper, perhaps less focused on construction, but implicitly to deliver some of those outcomes, we need a fit-for-purpose construction industry. It was really good, hour and a half ago, to sit alongside David Orr and launch the NHF's Futures Expo, just outside. What that is doing is a platform for innovation within not just the social housing and the housing association sector, but the wider housing sector is really important, because one of the challenges we have is to collaborate, and that is equally applicable in the housing association sector as it is in the volume house builder sector or the private developer sector. And innovation involves risk. It involves the need to share learning, to share risk, to collaborate, to do that jointly. And what you see outside, and I urge you all to take time to have a look at the stands outside. There's 5 strands of what the NHF are doing around innovation in our industry, all really, really important. And all too often, innovation's put in the too difficult box, from what I see, both in private developer world, but also in the housing association world. So we need to think of ways in which we de-risk things, and collaboration for me is a critically important part of that. And that's sharing knowledge, data, evidence base of what MMC, modern methods of construction, could represent here in 2018 and into the future. I would point to the excellent work being done by Home Group up in Gateshead at the Gateshead Innovation Village as an example of a progressive housing association wanting to prove what a modern construction technique really looks like, the learning from that, capturing the process, and sharing that with the rest of the industry. And I would urge other HAs in the room to be thinking similarly. And HAs, as I said, have a unique opportunity to drive that change in the wider sector. That core social purpose means the nuances of the drivers of the business and the organisations are very different. And it's about long-term thinking, hopefully assisted by the Prime Minister's earlier announcement, building assets that are not just traded at the end of the construction process, but managed, owned, and with an ongoing tenant interface, with a view on how you optimise not just CapEx, but whole life cost, tenant satisfaction, the whole piece. So this point about collaboration is really important. There's another point I would pick up as well, which is procurement. So the construction industry and its interface with the housing association sector often struggles with procurement. And if we're going to innovate, if we're going to drive change in the way we build, then housing associations have to be more intelligent in terms of their procurement frameworks and how they engage with the market. Some housing associations are vertically integrated, So they're actually managing change from within, and there's some very successful models emerging, the likes of Swan Housing and Accord and others that are embracing manufacturing and MMC, but others will rely on the construction market. So clear leadership of procurement, moving away from lowest cost, and I still see it even now, and even in the wake of Grenfell and some of the things that appear to be in the backdrop to what happened there should be a real focus on value and outcomes, not lowest cost. And that requires a different approach around procurement, and HAs have a big role to play in leading that change and procuring intelligently. Alongside procurement, there's a big issue, and it was alluded to in the previous session about financeability and the funding of MMC. I've been doing a big piece of work for MHCLG over the last 10 months looking at mortgage finance, technical assurance, validation, because what we cannot afford to happen is for innovation to go wrong on a large scale. We've all seen the legacy problems, certainly post-war, of different techniques being employed in construction that end up being a problem. And many housing associations have been stigmatized by that. It influences their thinking. It is influencing perhaps a reluctance to engage once more. We cannot afford for that to happen. So the critical thing is that we bring on a quality-led modern methods of construction sector across a whole host of different options, whether it's modular, volumetric, panelized components, whatever it is, it's got to be led by quality and it has to be accredited. And that's a massively important piece of work that we need to conclude. And I'm hopeful that in the next few weeks, perhaps months, we'll be launching something to industry that will give more confidence that's involved the mortgage finance market, the building insurance market. It's involved house builders, housing association representatives, Homes England, the ministry, and that will create a platform for confidence building. So I'll end with one point, and that is modern methods of construction is a term that's used a lot in our sector. I would urge you all to think more broadly than just the stereotypical image of a volumetric modular solution. Now, volumetric modular is going to be a critically important part of the future landscape, but we need time to build the capacity in that sector. In the interim, where the greatest opportunity lies for everyone to engage with this debate is in what I would call hybrid construction, where the proportion of what is built increases in terms of manufactured content. So we attack it in terms of further consolidation. It's parts of buildings being pre-manufactured. It doesn't have to be the whole thing. It can be a broad spectrum of solutions. And I would urge you all to think more widely about what that solution is for your organisation and how you can engage with that. So in closing, we have a great opportunity to use innovation in construction to drive social outcomes. If we can create a manufacturer-led environment, not just off-site but on-site, retrain people in new skills, multi-skills, using digital technologies, we're going to make our industry more attractive. We can do that on a local basis with local communities. We can access parts of the talent pool that we're not currently doing, and we can create real social value and real higher, better outcomes rather than just perhaps the tick box approach that you get at the moment in terms of corporate social responsibility or social value. Thank you for listening. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Mark. We haven't got a huge amount of time for questions, but I want to throw a few of my own, if I may. Lord Heseltine, I don't think you were in the room, but I think you've had a chance to look at the Prime Minister's speech this morning. I think people generally at this summit felt pleased broadly at her focus on housing, her commitment to social housing, the very fact that she was here, and indeed the £2 billion of money being made available earlier than it otherwise might have been. What was your take on the speech? I think you've had a chance to look at it.
Well, the $2 billion, as I understand it, is merely an extension of existing programs into a further period of time. That was inevitable. I mean, no one's going to close down the Homes Agency or the Housing Association movement. So, I mean, that was bound to happen, and I'm delighted that it's been announced. On the social housing side, there are so many things that need doing and are not being done with the determination that is required. I mentioned City Challenge, which we should be doing it all over the country now, and it would transform the social housing opportunities. It works, it was proven, and it did transform. So why did it stop? David Cameron's 100 Estate Initiative is a classic example where we were not given enough money, so we had to try and find packets of money in all sorts of other areas, and we were doing it. But it was a very slow, unorganized, uncooperative process.
The impression you gave in your speech, you talked about the sort of disorganization of Whitehall,
Yeah.
and the fact that you want to put us on a war footing, it seems to me, in terms of housing.
Yes, that's exactly
It sounds
what I
like you're
want to
very
do.
disappointed by, I mean, while people here maybe are sort of grateful for the fact the Prime Minister was turned up, I get the sense that you don't think that enough is being done. The ideas are not big enough.
I don't think they are. I think there were so many obvious, easy gains. I mentioned the HS2 stations. Why haven't we decided on development corporations to get on and build the communities? Everyone knows it's going to happen. You just don't have a station. A station becomes part of a huge urban conglomeration. So why aren't we doing it, planning it, working on it now? The Oxford-Cambridge corridor, it's bound to have the most profound effect in the need for housing and transport and community facilities. So why isn't someone in charge of doing it?
You mentioned development corporations, and within that, the issue of land value capture.
Yeah.
Today, the National Housing Federation has published some work that suggests the uplift value in a single year that planning permission brought was about £13 billion, which is more than the global profits of Amazon, Coca-Cola, and McDonald's combined. What would you do? I mean, it seems at the moment
I can tell you exactly what I would do. I would declare development corporations, and I would design compensation for compulsory purchase that was attractive, maybe double the value of the existing use, but that would be capped, and then as opposed to what could be 10 times the value it's under the present system, and maybe more. But if you have the present system, the landowners gain huge sums of money, and the public sector then has to provide all the infrastructure
and the
to
old
support.
new towns and things, they were actually funded pretty much at original value. The land was able to be purchased at low prices.
But when I talk about development corporations, I could have talked about new town corporations. It's the same thing.
Yep.
But they have the virtue, not just as they capture a lot of the value for public provision of services, but they actually built communities, which is my other preoccupation. I was responsible, until I was asked to leave, for the East End.
You were sacked, I think, Michael, actually.
I'm not here to try and get headlines, but sacked I was, that's perfectly true. But everyone knows that that area is going to be developed on a large scale. There is absolutely no question about it. It's calling out for it. But the urgency of getting it done is the thing that I find sort of unacceptable. And it is the fact that what will tend to happen, and the politics of it make it this way, is that there will be growth, but the growth will be field by field, because the row will be limited. If you actually say to people, okay, we're going to have to build communities, there are going to be new communities here, then you have a big row. But if you just let it happen, and the row is just one more appeal, one more field, a couple of fields, then the row is much smaller. It goes on, of course, over 30 years, but the politics of it are easier. Well, I'm personally in favor of politics that address the real issue, which is building proper communities, well-designed, and that have that enormous value that people want to be there. And to do that, you have to throw the resources of government behind. You have to put the infrastructure in. You have to be prepared to put public sector buildings in. You have to make them communities. You have to put schools in and that. But in building the schools, just give you one example. If you're building a school, it's going to have an assembly hall. So why not build assembly halls for the school that become community halls in the evening or the weekend? And then you can have concerts. and theatres and all that in one complex. But it needs that sort of thinking in advance to give the confidence to the private sector to then become part of the development process.
Mark Farmer, Lord Heseltine presents a picture of a need for us to think really big, to think joined up, to think dramatically. That's the scale of the crisis. He wants us to have a sort of Minister of Supply, a war footing kind of thing. Is that what's required? I mean, and could the sector in 2018, and indeed our politics, take on that kind of big thinking?
I agree with Lord Heseltine. I think there's definitely a need for joined-up thinking in government, and I see tension sometimes between MHCLG and BEIS, so the business department, and which is critically important at this particular stage for construction because of the industrial strategy
Which is why, presumably, Lord Heseltine said we need a minister at the top who just makes it happen, Minister of Supply. You know, why can't we run from the Cabinet Office or even from number 10?
Yeah, and I think it's a real issue in terms of continuity as well. So we know we've had this constant revolving position around housing ministers. That doesn't help as well in terms of rebriefing people and getting people up to speed. We definitely need big picture thinking. We need long-term thinking. In many respects, the issues that the housing sector has got and the construction industry has got, because they're intertwined, are not solvable within parliamentary cycles. You just need an apolitical...
Which is why maybe the 2 billion and the announcement that it is money ahead. I take Lord Heseltine's point. It's really just saying, yeah, we will still spend money on housing. But the sector seems to be thinking, well, that is a sign of confidence for the longer term.
Yeah, I think it will send the right message. I think it's probably an issue about scale. So how much impact will that 2 billion really have? But there's a real need for political consensus here. It was touched upon in one of the earlier panels in terms of having, if it was a Venn diagram of politics, making sure that bit in between is as big as possible, really, on the big picture issues.
But just one of the things that came up, industrial building. Now, I fully understand the anxiety based on the old asbestos housing and all that sort of post-war problem, that you can't expect the private sector person who's going to buy a home with a mortgage to take a huge risk that all their savings and goodness knows what could go under if you get the industrialized housing wrong. I understand that. But it is within the gift of government to say we need homes for nurses, homes for policemen, homes for a whole range of public sector workers. And therefore we will place contracts for industrial housing, perhaps near hospitals on empty sites there, and the public sector takes the risk. If it goes wrong, it'll be the public sector that knocks them down and starts again. But if you want to get industrial housing working on a scale, you've got to let proper contracts for significant scale development, and you can do it now. I've already been round industrial housing facilities. It can be done. And they look, I'm not talking about quality assurance, but I can tell you they look perfectly okay. And they could have a very substantial opportunity.
Can I ask you, in your long experience in politics, I mean, what seems to me that the issue is, you've got a government that doesn't have a majority, you've got a lot of backbench Conservative MPs as well as others who know that local opinion would be against that new bit of housing. That the whips will try and get them to support this, that, or the other, and they'll say, well, it's terribly difficult for me, because I've got this awful housing thing which my constituents don't want to have. Your proposal seems to be saying, sort of don't listen to them, just get in there, use your powers, just make it happen. Isn't that going to be really hard in the kind of volatile politics we have at the moment?
Yes, it is. But so what's the alternative? To let it drift? To leave the crisis go on? To fail to meet the aspirations of a younger generation? I believe exactly the opposite. I think the country is looking for that firm concept of tomorrow, to building a future of which we can be proud, and to recognize you will have to confront the people who say, not on my back garden.
We've heard two fantastic and really interesting speeches from two, as I said at the beginning, two heavyweights of this particular sector. It's been terrific. I'm sorry we haven't had more time for questions, but if you could show your appreciation to Lord Heseltine and Mark Knight. Thank you both very much indeed.